There are few things in life more jarring than waking up to the sound of goats screaming in harmony with Vivaldi's Four Seasons. At first, I thought I was having a stroke, until I opened my barn door and saw 30 wine glasses floating on a table covered in satin, fairy lights tangled in my hayloft, and Karen Buchanan, president of our HOA, shouting at a man on a ladder, "No, Harold! The vintage lighting must look rustic, not desperate." That's when I knew. Today was going to be war. It all started 3 weeks earlier, when the county redrew our zoning lines and my little slice of heaven, a quiet 12-acre property with goats, chickens, and a lovingly restored barn, got swallowed up by the HOA of Whispering Cedars. I hadn't wanted it, hadn't asked for it, and certainly didn't appreciate a welcome packet that included a mandatory lawn aesthetic guide and 3 coupons for tanning salons. But I figured I could lay low, keep to myself, and ride it out. That was before Karen got elected HOA president for the 3rd time in a row. She ran unopposed. No one else wanted the job. That should have been a red flag. Karen was the kind of woman who wore high heels to a potluck and called police on kids selling lemonade without permit. She'd once shut down a neighborhood car wash fundraiser because it threatened the resale value of the cul-de-sac. Now she was walking through my barn like she owned it, flipping through a guest list on her iPad and muttering something about imported olives and monogrammed corkscrews. I asked her what in God's name was going on. She turned to me with a smile that could curdle milk and said, "Oh, Hank, didn't you see the flyer? We're hosting a rustic wine tasting experience for HOA members. Chic meets country. And your barn is the perfect venue. It practically screams vintage rural elegance." I told her no. 3 times. Her response was to pull a laminated sheet from her purse and tap a paragraph in fine print. Subsection 14B of the Whispering Cedars HOA bylaws authorizing temporary communal use of suitable private structures for neighborhood functions. I read it twice. It didn't even make sense. It sounded like it had been translated from English to Martian and back again. But Karen acted like it was gospel, and next thing I knew, 3 volunteers were hauling my feed bags outside and replacing them with barrel tables. Now, I'm not a man prone to drama. I served in the military. I've seen real conflict. But nothing prepared me for watching Karen try to relocate my goats because their bleating clashed with her flute playlist. She moved them to the side pen, where they promptly chewed through a curtain rod and nearly swallowed an entire centerpiece made of raffia and dried fruit. Karen shrieked like she'd caught them eating her Prada. My goats looked her dead in the eye and burped. Her daughter, Madison, was live-streaming everything on some app I'd never heard of. She twirled around the barn in a flowing white dress and shouted to her followers, "We're setting up this super raw, authentic wine experience in this barn we found. It's giving Pinterest meets Pioneer vibes." I stepped in to correct her but was immediately shushed by Karen, who told me to let the creatives create. That was when I noticed they'd turned my farm sink into a DIY mimosa station and installed a ring light on my antique butter churn. The final straw came when Karen's sommelier arrived, a man named Bryce who wore a scarf indoors and introduced himself as a liquid storyteller. He sniffed the air like he was hunting truffles, wrinkled his nose and said, "We'll need to mask the animal odors. Maybe incense or a lavender diffuser." I asked him if he realized this was a barn. He asked me if I realized scent was an emotional gateway to memory. I offered to let my goats headbutt him into one. That night, after the last box of overpriced wine was wheeled into my barn's walk-in cooler, I stood in the doorway, staring at what had once been my sanctuary. Now it looked like a budget wedding reception exploded inside a Cracker Barrel. My tools were piled in the corner. My feed buckets were gone. And worst of all, my goats, my girls, looked traumatized. One was chewing a paper lantern like it owed her money. Karen brushed past me, balancing a wine crate on one hip. She didn't even look at me when she said, "Don't worry, old-timer. We'll clean it all up after the event. Unless your goats eat something important. Then we might have to discuss restitution." I didn't answer her. I just smiled and nodded. But inside, something cracked open. Something dark. Something ancient and petty. I realized I wasn't going to fight her through HOA bylaws. I wasn't going to argue about property lines and zoning codes. No. Karen had stepped into my barn, my domain, and turned it into a winery for her ego and her TikTok dreams. So I was going to do what any self-respecting farmer with a long memory and a grudge would do. I was going to make sure that her wine tasting event was one nobody ever forgot. And I knew just the person who could help. My nephew Brad, high school chemistry teacher by day, amateur special effects wizard by night, and the proud owner of several industrial-sized jugs of vinegar. We had 3 days until the event. Plenty of time to brew up a little revenge cocktail. As I walked back to the house, I passed my favorite goat, Jolene, who gave me a look that said she too had had enough of Karen. I patted her on the head and said, "Don't worry, girl. We're gonna fix this." That's when she burped again, loud and proud, right as Karen's daughter walked by filming. Madison shrieked and jumped, dropping her phone into a trough of rainwater. It was a sign. The barn was ready. So was I. ChatGPT said. By sunrise the next morning, I was already ankle-deep in vinegar and plotting. The barn still reeked of whatever Karen sprayed to cover up the smell of livestock, and one of my goats had chewed through a table runner that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. As I stood there sipping my coffee, watching the barn sparkle like a rejected set from The Bachelor, I pulled out my old flip phone and dialed Brad. Brad answered with a grunt, probably still asleep. I didn't waste time. I said, "How do you feel about turning wine night into a little science project?" Brad laughed before I even explained. That's the thing about family. You only need to say half the sentence. He was already throwing on a hoodie and grabbing his keys. By mid-morning, he pulled up in a dusty Subaru filled with enough weird bottles and chemicals to get us on a watch list. He popped the trunk like he was unveiling a magic trick, grinning ear to ear. "You want red or white sabotage?" he asked. "Because I've got both." We started in the garage with taste tests. Not for pleasure, obviously. We needed to know just how close we could mimic the colors and textures of Karen's precious wine list. Brad had labels printed to match her actual inventory. Chateau de Snoot, Whispering Glen, Sauvignon de blah blah, and we began filling them with cleverly concocted mixtures. The reds were mostly apple cider vinegar with a splash of beet juice for color. The whites were goat milk, slightly thinned and chilled to give it that crisp, refreshing feel. For the sweet wines, we added a bit of syrup to the milk to create that cloying, dessert wine vibe Karen loved to brag about. We even threw in a bottle with pickle juice, just for variety. While we worked, Brad kept saying things like, "This is for every HOA that ever finds someone for a lawn gnome, and I'm doing this for Uncle Barry, rest his soul, who got sued over a weather vane." I didn't stop him. The anger was generational at this point. That night, while the HOA committee members were presumably off getting their outfits pressed for the big event, Brad and I snuck into the barn. Karen had stored the real wine in the walk-in cooler, all labeled and stacked neatly. We worked quickly, removing each bottle, draining it into a hidden bucket weed lined with bags, and refilling it with our custom blends. Then we recorked and resealed the bottles using a heat gun Brad borrowed from his chemistry lab. Every label was perfect. Every seal looked factory tight. There wasn't a soul alive who would question the switch, at least not until they took a sip. After 2 hours, every bottle had been replaced. We stashed the real wine in my root cellar, just in case Karen tried to accuse us of theft later. Insurance, we called it. Brad wanted to keep a few for his collection. I told him only if he promised to drink one every time he had to attend a faculty meeting. With the wine taken care of, we moved on to the goat protocol. Now, my goats are not just adorable, they're smart. Jolene, in particular, had a knack for opening latches. So Brad rigged a simple mechanism on the barn door. If someone opened it just the right way, it would trigger the latch on the side pen. The goats would pour out right into the heart of the event. We positioned their pen near the dessert wine station for maximum chaos. Goats love sugar. It wasn't science, it was instinct. To make things even better, I strapped a GoPro to one of the goats using an old harness I'd fashioned years ago when I tried to train Jolene for county fair races. She hated running, but she didn't mind wearing a camera. The idea was simple. Capture everything from the goat's eye view. Spilled wine. Screaming guests. Karen's face in glorious 1080p. Just before we left the barn that night, Brad stood in the center of it all, surrounded by barrel tables, lace bunting, and fake grapevines, and shook his head. "This is gonna be beautiful," he whispered, as if we were about to premiere a Shakespearean tragedy. The morning of the event was calm, deceptively so. Karen arrived early, flanked by her usual trio of minions, all wearing matching lavender blazers. They were clucking about wine glass placement and the order of the tasting stations. Bryce, the sommelier, showed up wearing a new scarf, one that looked like it had been woven from regret and overpriced ambition. He began polishing glasses and humming something operatic. Karen walked around with a clipboard, looking more like a dictator than a host. I kept a low profile, pretending to patch a fence just outside the barn. Every time Karen glanced at me, I smiled and gave a little salute. She ignored me. That was fine. I preferred it that way. The less she suspected, the sweeter the reveal would be. By noon, the guests began to arrive. HOA members, local realtors, 2 town council members, and a food blogger from the next county over. Everyone wore wide-brimmed hats or pastel suit. Someone even brought a drone to capture aerial shots of the ambience. It buzzed overhead like a curious mosquito while Karen gave an opening speech. She stood at the center of my barn, holding a glass of fake wine with the poise of a budget Martha Stewart, and announced, "Today is not just about wine, it's about community. About refinement. About celebrating the spirit of Whispering Cedars." Applause followed. Cameras flashed. I grinned. The first round of tastings began. Brad and I leaned against the barn door, out of sight but close enough to hear the murmurs. There was confusion at first. Someone whispered that the wine was very bold. Another said it was earthy, maybe too earthy. A woman near the back spit hers back into her glass and whispered, "Is this off?" Karen, not missing a beat, waved it off. "It's a rare varietal. It has a challenging profile." When the goat milk wines were poured, things escalated quickly. One man coughed so hard he dropped his glass. A woman dabbed at her tongue with a napkin and said, "That's not Chardonnay. That's dairy." Karen's smile twitched just a little. Bryce took a long sip, paused, and muttered something about unexpected creaminess. I was almost in tears, holding back laughter. Then a guest near the dessert station tried to get some fresh air, pulled on the side door, exactly the one we rigged, and the latch released. It was glorious. The goats exploded into the barn like a fluffy stampede of chaos. Jolene led the charge, head held high, GoPro bobbing on her harness. They trampled centerpieces, knocked over a pyramid of wine glasses, and one of them jumped onto a cheese platter with both front hooves. People screamed. Wine spilled. Karen shouted, "The goats! Who let out the goats?" Brad turned to me, eyes wide with joy. "This is better than prom." I just nodded, arms crossed, as Karen slipped in a puddle of goat milk and landed flat on her back, Bryce's scarf trailing behind her like a defeated flag. And the best part? The camera on Jolene was still rolling. From the second Jolene and the rest of the herd burst into that barn, the event spiraled into chaos so fast it looked like a slow-motion car crash happening in real time. The music cut off, people screamed, and for the first few seconds, no one moved, as if they couldn't quite process what was happening. Guests stood frozen, clutching their half-empty glasses of goat milk wine, eyes wide as Jolene launched herself onto the gift table and knocked a basket of Whispering Cedars branded corkscrews into the air like confetti. The first person to move was Karen. She shrieked something unintelligible, probably a mix of HOA jargon and threats, and ran toward the goats, arms flailing like she was trying to shoo away pigeons. One of the goats, Meryl's sheep, mistook her sequin shawl for a snack and lunged. Karen spun to get away, slipped on the glossy floor, and fell backward right into the edge of a folding table. It flipped, sending 3 bottles of goat milk wine into the air. They exploded on impact, splashing guests and showering Karen in her own ruined ambition. People were trying to flee, but in every direction there was a goat. Jolene stood triumphantly on top of the dessert bar, munching through a tiered cake made entirely of brie. 2 of the younger goats had discovered the floral arrangements and were dragging them across the floor like war trophies. One man tried to pull his wife out by the hand, only for both of them to get tangled in the ring light cables Madison had set up earlier for live streaming. They fell in a heap, pulling the lights down in a cascade that shattered glass and set off a chain reaction of spills and screams. Bryce, the scarf-wrapped sommelier, stood in the middle of it all, clutching a wine bottle like a lifeline. He looked around at the carnage, then took a cautious sip. His face twisted into an expression of betrayal and confusion. This isn't even fermented," he mumbled, before staggering toward the cooler in a daze, muttering something about needing to recalibrate his palate. Madison, still clutching her phone with a cracked screen, had turned the chaos into content. She was filming, her voice breathless with disbelief. "Guys, we're in the middle of the worst wine-tasting disaster in HOA history. This is like if Napa Valley got attacked by livestock." She panned the camera around, capturing Karen covered in cheese shrapnel and goat hoof prints, Bryce weeping softly in the corner, and several guests trying to climb through a side window to escape. The view count was ticking up rapidly, thousands of comments pouring in, filled with laughter emojis and cries of "release the full video." One of the goats got into the decorative fruit table and discovered the watermelon centerpiece. It took approximately 12 seconds for it to explode in a pink splash across half the barn. The drone, which had been circling lazily overhead, suddenly dipped as a goat jumped up and headbutted it mid-air. It spiraled to the ground, crashing right into the wine display. A slow, sticky river of vinegar and milk ran across the floor toward the front entrance like it was trying to escape too. Karen tried to take control. She stood up, absolutely drenched, mascara streaking down her face, one heel broken, and yelled, "Stop the event! This is not authorized behavior. Someone call security." There was, of course, no security, because Karen had insisted that rural authenticity didn't need supervision. In that moment, the look in her eyes wasn't just rage. It was the dawning realization that she had created the very disaster unraveling around her. I stepped forward, out of the shadows near the door, clapping slowly. Everyone turned. I didn't say a word for a moment, just walked in, hands behind my back, boots splashing in the sticky mess on the floor. The goats calmed as I passed them, recognizing me, even Jolene hopping down to walk beside me like a loyal sidekick. It was theatrical, and I knew it. I wanted every second of this burned into Karen's memory. Karen pointed a trembling, cheese-covered finger at me. You did this. You sabotaged us. I'm calling the board. I'll have your property seized. I'll sue you for damages." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean damages from your unauthorized use of my barn? Or the mental distress you caused my goats?" There were murmurs. People were filming. Karen's face twitched, realizing she was being watched not just by angry guests, but potentially thousands of internet strangers. She tried to rally, turning to the crowd. "Everyone, please, don't listen to this man. He's clearly unstable. And this isn't his barn anymore, it's community shared space. He signed the bylaws." I pulled out a printed page, Section 14B, the same one she'd used against me, and read it aloud. "Temporary communal use of suitable private structures, with prior written consent from the property owner." Which I never gave. In fact, I sent an email objecting. With a timestamp. "Want to see it." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Bryce groaned from the corner, clutching a bottle like it owed him money. Madison's phone dinged as another livestream platform asked her to monetize. The tension broke when one of the goats loudly pooped on Karen's clipboard. She let out a scream that could shatter glass and marched straight toward the exit, slipping one final time and landing in a pile of party favors. The guests didn't follow. Most were too stunned, too sticky, or too amused. I waved to the few who made eye contact and said, "Y'all are welcome to stay for some real cheese. It's not brie stacked into a cake, but it won't bite back either." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the barn finally cleared out, Brad and I watched the GoPro footage on a laptop in my kitchen. Jolene's point of view was priceless. She'd charged into the center of the chaos like a knight in fuzzy armor. The footage captured Karen's downfall with cinematic timing, and Brad declared it award-worthy. We posted a short, anonymous clip of the event online under the title, "When Wine Meets Bovine." Within an hour, it had over 50,000 views. People were commenting things like, "This is art," "Release the goat cut," and "Karen got curdled." As the moon rose over the fields, I sat on my porch with a real glass of wine, none of that vinegar nonsense, and clinked it against Brad's. The goats rested peacefully in their pen, no longer confined to the side like some afterthought. They'd earned their freedom, and as I looked out over the barn, glitter still stuck to the hay bales and a faint trail of spilled goat milk catching the moonlight, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since before the HOA invaded. For once, justice hadn't come in the form of fines or letters or empty apologies. It had come with hooves, chaos, and a perfectly executed plan. And the best part was, tomorrow's HOA meeting was going to be even more entertaining. The HOA emergency meeting was scheduled for the next evening, and it was already shaping up to be more dramatic than a soap opera wedding. Word of the barn incident had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and even some of the more apathetic HOA members, the ones who normally only showed up for the free cookies, were now clearing their schedules for the showdown. Karen called it a matter of community integrity. Most of us just wanted to see if she would try to explain away the wine-tasting fiasco without mentioning the goats, the milk, or the viral video currently racking up views faster than wildfire spreads through dry brush. By the time I walked into the Whispering Cedars clubhouse, it was standing room only. Folding chairs had been dragged out from storage, and there was even a makeshift podium set up at the front, complete with a Whispering Cedars logo printed on a canvas banner that someone clearly made in a rush. Karen stood behind it in a crisp lavender blazer, hair freshly done, makeup fighting hard to mask the swelling bruise on her elbow, courtesy of the dessert table incident. Her daughter Madison hovered in the back, sunglasses indoors, trying to look unbothered while nervously checking her phone. Karen cleared her throat and called the meeting to order. Her voice was shaky but determined, the voice of a woman clinging to her last shred of authority with both hands. She launched into a rehearsed speech about preserving neighborhood values and the dangers of unsanctioned agricultural environments. She made it sound like my goats were armed militia. When she mentioned deliberate sabotage of HOA property, the room let out a collective hum of disbelief. Someone in the back coughed the word barn, and laughter rippled across the room. I waited until she was nearly done before I stood up. No drama, no theatrics, just calm, deliberate movement as I walked to the front and handed the current HOA secretary a printed folder. Inside was everything. Timestamps of my emails rejecting the barn use, a notarized statement about the unauthorized entry, and most importantly, a printed transcript of the HOA's own bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted. Karen went pale as the secretary began flipping through the pages, her lips pursing tighter with each line she read. Then, I handed over the USB stick. If anyone would like to see exactly what happened during the wine tasting, I said, I've got a goat's eye view that covers everything from the moment they let themselves in to the second the last wine bottle exploded on the floor. Karen tried to interrupt, but it was too late. The secretary plugged it into the projector. The lights dimmed. And there it was. Jolene's heroic charge into the event played across the wall like a war documentary. Karen flailing, guests screaming, milk and vinegar splashing like confetti. And then, the cherry on top, Karen slipping and landing directly into her own cheese board, goat hooves clattering around her in glorious surround sound. The room exploded in laughter. Even the most uptight residents couldn't help themselves. The only person not amused was Karen, whose face burned so red it could have powered the projector itself. When the lights came back on, I turned back to the room. Look, I didn't want this fight. I just wanted to be left alone to run my little farm in peace. I didn't ask to be in the HOA, and I certainly didn't invite anyone into my barn. I was mocked, trespassed on, and had my animals pushed aside like lawn ornaments. So I responded the only way I knew how, with a little creativity and a lot of vinegar. There was silence, then applause. Real applause. Not polite clapping, but the kind that came from people who had clearly been waiting years to see someone stand up to Karen. A man in the front row even whistled. The secretary announced that, based on the evidence, Karen had clearly violated multiple HOA codes, including unauthorized use of private property and endangering livestock. She was suspended from her role as president effective immediately, pending a formal vote. Karen tried to protest, claimed it was all an elaborate prank, and that she was the victim of an orchestrated smear campaign, but it was clear she'd lost the room. Madison slipped out quietly, possibly already drafting her apology video. Karen, for the first time in her iron-fisted HOA reign, was rendered powerless. Later that week, something strange happened. The video, originally just uploaded anonymously to stir the pot, caught fire. Not just locally. It was picked up by a popular internet news channel that specialized in viral suburban meltdown. Comments flooded in from around the world. People called Jolene a hero. Artists started drawing fan art of her with a tiny cape. A t-shirt design went viral. Sour grapes, sweet justice, with a cartoon goat trampling a wine glass. Brad was thrilled. He ordered 5 for himself and started referring to Jolene as Commander Chaos. Then came the email. A small but growing production company that specialized in offbeat reality television reached out. They loved the story, the visuals, the petty genius of the revenge. They wanted to meet me. They pitched a show, Barnstormed, featuring rural residents pulling clever comebacks against suburban nonsense. It sounded ridiculous. It also sounded fun. I told them maybe. Meanwhile, the barn was returned to its former glory. The wine stains were mostly gone. The goats were happy. I got a check from the HOA to cover damages, an amount far more generous than I expected. Turns out, some of the newer board members were eager to wipe the whole incident from the books and start fresh. I started hosting small gatherings of my own, just neighbors who wanted to enjoy some actual cheese and maybe watch the infamous video one more time. People brought food, asked to meet Jolene, even helped repaint the barn door. One man, a retired dentist, offered to make a wooden sign for the barn that read Goat Gallop Winery, where the tasting notes are explosive. I let him. And Karen? She moved 2 towns over. Rumor has it she's started a new HOA, this time in a gated community with stricter rules and 0 livestock. I wish them luck. They're going to need it. One quiet evening, as I sat on the porch with Jolene resting her head against my knee, I raised a glass of real wine, good wine this time, and stared out across the peaceful field. The barn stood quietly in the distance, glowing in the sunset. The goats grazed. The chaos was behind us. Almost. Because when Brad called later that night and said, "The production company wants a pilot episode," I looked at Jolene and said, "Guess it's time for one more adventure." She bleated once, like she already knew.